artsy types. Like it's all very.
She's doing, I don't know her exact title, sustainability, but more so on the Aboriginal side and with food security. So, yeah.
You know what? I usually never say musician until I'm
having a hard time finding something to win. It's like, well, maybe I can drum up. Yeah.
It's really beautiful.
I know I will. I spent a lot of time with it. Worked a lot.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody.
Everywhere.
How you feeling? That was lame. Come on, how you doing, everybody? Are you all ready to talk about capitalism? Well, good evening and welcome to our event, Unions, Young Workers, and Capitalism. I'm sure we're going to have a lively discussion tonight. My name's Kyle Buott. I'm the president of the Halifax-Dartmouth District Labour Council, and I will be your moderator for the evening. Pardon?
Turn it up.
Turn it up?
Oh.
Can we turn it up?
Yes. Why don't you talk?
How's that? Better?
Yeah.
Still better?
Yeah.
More better?
Even better.
Even better. What? Okay. Well, this evening we're going to have a panel of 3 speakers to talk a little bit about young workers, capitalism, and the trade union movement. After that, we're going to have a few pre-prepared questions that I'll be asking, and then if there's time, we'll also take a handful of questions from the audience. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to quickly thank our sponsors and the folks who organized this, then walk through some introductions of our panelists, and then give you a little bit of a framework that we set this talk up with as well. So first off, we are pleased to be presenting tonight with 5 different organizations that have come together to pull this panel off, and they are the Public Service Alliance of Canada Atlantic, and we've got some folks from the PSAC Young Workers Conference here in the crowd as well, so be sure to chat with some of them. The Halifax-Dartmouth District Labour Council, representing about 25,000 unionized workers across the city. We have the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and they've got a table in the back. They'll be selling copies of Nora's book at the end of the evening, and I guess she'll even be signing some autographs, so make sure you check that out. The Canadian Federation of Students, which unites 500,000 students from across the country in every province. And also Solidarity Halifax, a local anti-capitalist organization. So I've been asked to let folks know there is free coffee there on the side. Please take advantage of that. The washrooms are at the back and over on the side as well, so if you need to slip out for that. It is going to get a little warm in here. We've got the windows open, and we may try to open a few more if we can figure that out. Also, I've been asked to let you know that if you're tweeting tonight, if you're into that, the hashtag is going to be YoungWorkersNS. And so if you want to follow it as well, there'll be live tweeting of the event by 2 people, and you can catch up with those updates later as well. We are also recording this evening's event, and that'll be uploaded to YouTube. So if you know someone that's missed tonight's event and they'd like to see what happened, they're able to do it that way. So first off, I'd like to introduce our 3 panelists. Immediately to my right is Charlie Huntley. Charlie is a 25-year-old, recently unionized coffee shop worker here at Just Us Cafe. The first unionized coffee shop in the Maritimes. And Charlie is also a member of Solidarity Halifax and a member of the Baristas Rise Up campaign to improve working conditions for baristas across the city. Charlie is a general troublemaker from Hants County. And they work for workers' rights and dream of a liberated socialist society. Next to Charlie is Nick Stark. Nick is a graduate of the University of King's College in contemporary philosophy. He was the president of the King's Student Union from 2012 to 2013 and has been on the executive of the Canadian Federation of Students Nova Scotia for the past 3 years, the last 2 as the National Executive Board rep to the CFS. Welcome, Nick. Over on the far right is...
It's my left. No, it's my right. It's your left.
We have Nora Loreto. Nora is a writer, musician, and activist based in Quebec City, and she's the author of From Demonized to Organized, Building the New Union Movement, which was published in 2013 from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives.
Thank you.
She has a master's of... Thank you. She's got a Master's of Education Foundation from the University of Saskatchewan and a degree in Public Administration from Ryerson University. Nora is currently editing the Labour series Up, Canadian Labour Rising for Rabble.ca, which if you haven't checked it out yet, go to Rabble.ca and check out a series of what's happening with young workers across the country. She's also a member of Quebec Solidaire and is active on her district executive. Nora was also heavily involved with the Canadian Federation of Students in Ontario. So, welcome Nora. So, we're here tonight to talk about the role of modern capitalism, young workers, and the role the labor movement can play in that process. And there's a few key concepts that I want to highlight before we get started. Today we're living in what people are calling the post-employment economy. And what that means is that since the recession in 2008, corporate profits have rebounded, the banks' profits have rebounded, big oil's profits have rebounded, the stock markets are rising on a regular basis, but the jobs are totally missing. What we have right now is a situation where since the recession began, we've actually lost close to 1 million jobs that have not been created across the country. And that has huge implications for young workers who are trying to enter the workforce. In Nova Scotia, we're dealing with a 27% unemployment rate for workers from the ages of 15 to 25. And in some regions of the province, like Cape Breton or the Annapolis Valley, the numbers are even worse. But not all hope is lost. Because in the last few years, we've actually seen the new rise of major social movements across North America. From the Occupy movement, which started at Occupy Wall Street and then expanded to over 500 cities across the globe, which raised the question of the difference between the 99%, those of us who actually work for a living, and the 1%, the rich, or the ruling class, who are the ones on top. We've also seen the Wisconsin occupation of their state house for weeks in opposition to anti-labor legislation, and thousands of people mobilizing in the streets. We've seen the Quebec student strike, which led to the largest single demonstration in the history of North America, when 600,000 students, trade unionists, and their allies took to the streets of Montreal to oppose a government plan to increase tuition fees. We saw the rise of the Idle No More movement across Canada and then spread across the world as Indigenous people rose up to defend their rights. We saw the Quebec general construction strike. And for those of you in the labor movement, the construction unions are not the most radical element of our movement. For them to have a general strike in Quebec is a huge, huge moment. And finally, on Monday morning, the class struggle in Canada is going to get more intense when 41,000 teachers in British Columbia walk off the job to protect public education and fight for kids' rights to get a public education. So not all hope is lost. We're still able to fight back. And tonight our question is, how do we build that type of movement that will engage young workers and let us actually fight back effectively? So we're going to go through each of the presentations. They'll have 10 minutes. We're going to go in the order in the line here. And I'll be giving them a 2-minute notice when their time is getting close. So if you see me furiously handing someone some paper, that's what that is. After that, we'll go into a few prepared questions and discussion, and then finally some questions from the audience. Any issues, problems before we get started? Awesome. So first up is Charlie Huntley from Baristas Rise Up and Solidarity Halifax.
Before we get started, I think it's important that we have a working definition of what capitalism and neoliberalism are. Capitalism is an oppressive economic system in which trade, industry, and the means of production are controlled by a few private owners with the goal of making profits in a market economy. Neoliberalism is a form of capitalism that supports free trade, open markets, privatization, deregulation, and enhancing the role of the private sector in modern society. It sounds like hell to me, and all three of our current political parties have platforms that are based on a variation of this capitalist system. That is why I'm a part of a group called Solidarity Halifax. Our table is just located to the back there if you want to join. Solidarity Halifax is a membership-based anti-capitalist organization located here in Halifax. Some things we're committed to include building alternatives to capitalism, democratic, non-sectarian, and pluralist politics, actively opposing all forms of discrimination and oppression, actively opposing all threats to sustainability and the health of our natural environment, and creating a culture of solidarity. Again, if you would like to join, the table's just back there. Okay, let's get into it. For young folks with little to no job experience, accompanied with job scarcity, breaking into the job market and finding an entry-level position is somewhere between difficult and impossible. According to the Community Foundations of Canada, 1 in 3 students move through low-skilled jobs after graduation. That is, only if you're lucky to get a job. Like Kyle was saying, the youth unemployment rate is 27% for ages 15 to 25 and 14% from ages 25 to 35. For me, after graduation in 2011, I fluctuated between being underemployed and unemployed for about a year. Then I found a job here at the cafe. It's a nice cafe, but it's not exactly my dream career, and it came with some harsh realities too. Let's just say capitalism has put us and continues to put us as young workers in precarious employment positions by overvaluing profits and undervaluing people. Even ethical fair trade companies still have managers and middle managers who are given a budget that pressures them to make the biggest bang for your buck. This can put you in a tricky spot when your labor cost is your last cost that isn't fixed, like stock, rent, and bills. This means there's pressure on management to cut labor costs by A, cutting workers' breaks, B, having part-time heavy staff, C, having a lean staff, which means to staff as few people as they can get away with, and D, wage theft. These are just a few ways in which labor can be exploited, among many. So over a year ago, my coworkers and I decided that forming a union with the Service Employees International Union would be a good idea, because we were sick of 1, being denied breaks, 2, tips being used to cover shortages, and 3, seeing people fired without just cause. We knew that with a union, we could bargain a collective agreement that would mandate breaks, give us control of tips, and give us a grievance procedure when things went wrong. This was about the time that we formed the group Baristas Rise Up, which was a modest worker-led unionization movement among baristas in Halifax. We were committed to improving working conditions and industry standards. Now, I'm grateful to our new manager who hasn't even been tempted to use those labor-cutting cost methods, but even so, benevolent managers aren't going to bring about the change needed. Joining a union means there's a binding contract with specific enforceable rules that state not to use those exploitative practices, accompanied with a grievance procedures that must be respected and followed. Those rules apply no matter who our manager is, and because managers come and go, as well as staff, contracts make the rules of the road very clear to both parties. But these are just the ways that labor organizing and unions work on a single shop floor. The more I get involved in my union, the SEIU, and Solidarity Halifax, the more I realize unions can and do play a bigger role in counting neoliberal capitalism and austerity. Capitalism has boom and bust cycles that can be countered with public spending during busts to help the economy from going too far under. But since the 2008 recession, neoliberal governments have cut public spending on the platform of needing to balance the budget, which sounds like a reasonable explanation, but it's rhetoric that ignores that it's actually quite natural to run a deficit in times of economic downturns, because money from the economic booms will balance the budget. Now, according to a labor bulletin, youth are often the first to be laid off during economic downturns and the last to find employment when the economy begins to rebound. This means the boom and bust cycles of capitalism affect us as young workers more than our older counterparts. Throw high tuition fees and spending cuts on top of economic busts, and things get pretty ugly. High rates of youth unemployment alone creates a challenge for unions, including us in their struggle. But this challenge is also accompanied with a generation largely of folks who don't know what a union is, let alone what benefits they could gain by joining one. So unions really have their work cut out for them, and I would argue aren't rising to the challenge. Not yet, anyway. So I have 6 suggestions for the labor movement and unions. One, I think unions need to get better at educating the public about their benefits. I think an ideological turning point for me was during the postal workers lockout in 2011 when I saw a sign that said, "Maternity leave, brought to you by striking postal workers." This is exactly the kind of messaging that would be hugely successful if it were spread in a creative and comprehensive manner. 2. Unions need to translate and better publicize the language that is used by neoliberal governments. One example of unions using that kind of tactic is during the rise of the Conservatives talking about the right-to-work legislation. Unions properly translated that legislation to the right to work for less. 3. Unions need to maintain and fight for the jobs that are threatened with cuts and two-tier bargaining. Two-tier bargaining is creating a collective agreement that allows new employees to receive fewer benefits than current employees. This kind of bargaining sells young people and new Canadians down the river and needs to stop. Another thing unions could do is to bring back organizing the unemployed. I'm not sure exactly how we do that, but we could start by educating and organizing the people at the EI office locations around austerity, because if you've spent any time there, you'll notice that folks are already agitated because the wait is so damn long. 5. Additionally, I'd love to see unions here and everywhere start a living wage campaign. The Fight for 15 campaigns in the US are inspiring, and we could definitely take a leaf out of their booklet to look for strategies. 6. But most importantly, unions need to start organizing and continue organizing where young people work, the food services and the retail industry. I've been told that it was unusual for the SEIU to organize our small low-wage workplace. Our organizing drive shouldn't be an anomaly, it needs to become commonplace. If we want the labor movement to thrive, young workers absolutely need unions' resources to back their activism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and even with 30 seconds to spare, over to Nick Stark from the Canadian Federation of Students.
Thanks, Kyle. There we go. So thanks again for having me. So my name is Nick Stark. The Canadian Federation of Students, as Kyle mentioned, unites over 500,000 students across the country. Can you hear me? Is this okay?
You might be better off using that.
Yeah, the other mic sounds better.
It's okay, I'm gonna switch. Oh, maybe this will work. Great, thanks. So, in addition to uniting folks across the country, we also unite folks provincially, and I've spent the past 3 years on the executive of our provincial component in Nova Scotia. We have 5 members, one of which I was president of, the King Student Union, and others in the HRM and around the province. And we fight for a variety of social justice issues, post-secondary issues particularly, but also really the rights of all people, and that includes solidarity with labor. So I'm going to touch on that in my remarks. So I think it's clear that the challenges that students face, and I'm going to present a student lens tonight because that's really what I know, of course. The challenges that students face are those that face us all universally, workers of all ages. And that has to be recognized, I think, by students and older workers, because only then, by sharing our knowledge with each other, can we hope to maintain a strong movement for justice. So for a long time, students have recognized that we exist in an economic system that oppresses both students and workers. On the one hand, we experience the ravages of capitalism firsthand, first as consumers of the education system, and then as products subject to market forces. Either we indebt ourselves, or work multiple part-time jobs, or both, to pay the ever-increasing costs of education for ever-diminishing returns. The diminishing number of tenured faculty are being replaced by contract teaching staff who don't have the time to do more than mark papers, really, so our quality suffers. At the same time, we endanger our mental health and physical health trying to cope with the stress of paying for school, food, rent, everything else. And when we seek help, we're usually put on a waiting list for already inadequate services that aren't being funded by the government or our institutions. And all of this as university administrators are being paid more and more for doing less and less. So institutionally, students have a real motivation to organize and resist. And we also see the failure of capitalism in society at large. We're not stupid. We recognize that our education system isn't designed to work in our favor, be it in post-secondary education or in the workforce. There's a real crisis, as Charlie mentioned, in Kyle, in youth and underemployment, and there are fewer good, well-paid, unionized jobs. And what used to be even mediocre jobs have turned into unpaid internships, which is something that we're facing really all over. Students experience these problems firsthand, and our way of responding to them is the same as that of workers, by recognizing institutional issues as particular manifestations of an unjust economic system, and uniting local unions together, for example in the Canadian Federation of Students, to provide an even more powerful voice for students. So together we amplify and direct our voices. And this isn't anything new. The CFS has been active since the beginning of the 1980s in response to the beginning of the neoliberal agenda. And we've worked since then to combat social and economic ills alongside labor and social justice organizations. But I do think that we're at a point in time where it's particularly important that the labor and student movements learn from each other and communicate. There are several factors at play that make this moment particularly ripe for collaboration. First, continued unrest over the injustices of capitalism after the financial crisis, particularly the failures of our leaders to bring the perpetrators to justice and remedy the inequality of our society. Second, dissatisfaction, that's to put it lightly, with the Harper government, and a sense of urgency over the next federal election, I think we all feel. Third, an all-time high for tuition fees and student debt that makes this generation of students particularly persuadable to take action. And finally, a real necessity to reinvigorate the union movement, to give agency to young workers and make unions relevant to young people. Okay, sure. So how do we do that? I actually think that student unions, which I do see as unions, have an important role to play. So it's obviously important that we continue to show solidarity with labor, something that we at the CFS make a particular effort to do, be it with cuts to Canada Post, essential services legislation for nurses.
You got a water bottle that's down and it's dripping on the
Oh, it is, isn't it?
Oh,
explode.
very good.
Thank you. This is this is a CFS water bottle. The top wasn't on. It actually didn't work really well. And this is a great example of a product that we run a bulk purchasing service. Yeah, true. See Nora's and of Nora's book. But anyway, we work with workers to actually make ethical products and deliver those to students at orientation weeks. So that's the kind of example of the thing that we do. Yeah. Okay. So hopefully we won't electrocute Nora.
No.
Okay, great. So showing solidarity with labor. It's also important that we communicate that solidarity to our members and make the point explicitly that just as we need student unions in order to guarantee a good education, we need labor unions to guarantee good working conditions. And unfortunately, some students actually work against that understanding and do side with university administrations and governments in labor disputes. These students fail to see that doing so undermines their own forms of collective organizing and the educational system that they claim to be preserving. So it's important that student unions publicly communicate their support for faculty and staff when there are labor disputes. And I think that the same, in a way, is true for labor unions. Communicating how student unions defend the rights of faculty and staff and support all workers in the fight for fair wages, good working conditions, promotes a sense of shared struggle and mutual reliance that we need to combat the rhetoric of entitlement that's really being pushed by conservatives. Because it's probably the biggest threat to the relevance of unions, and it seems to be working. Because we can both be painted with the same brush, both young people and workers. That youth are entitled for expecting that the prosperity of the post-war era will be given to them without sacrifice, and older workers are entitled for having received such generous pensions and job stability in a time where young people are suffering. And this tactic of divide and conquer has been working. So, we need to find a way of addressing that. Nora makes the point in her book that campaigns like drawing attention to the victories of unions can sometimes work, but don't always, because something like weekends, regular hours of work don't necessarily really apply to young people in the same way that they used to. One way I think to reinstill that sense of relevance is to explicitly address the issues that the people of my generation do care about: climate justice, gender equality, mental health, to name a few. And this is something that I think the CFS is particularly good at, and some unions do too, but it's something we can maybe be more explicit about. Even though there are so many things to fight, it's important that we frame our fight in a way that makes it relevant to people of all ages. Obviously, we also need to do what Charlie said. We need to find where students and young people are in the job force and organize around them. I think that obviously Brew is a good example of that, but I also think that something like unpaid internships, student unions have a role to play there in doing the same thing. And finally, changing the way unions in general are run. So what Unifor is doing with community chapters is, I find, particularly admirable, and having meaningful representation from diverse communities imparts a sense of ownership that we need if we're going to engage a more pluralistic workforce. So in the end, it comes down to solidarity, and it's a truism that if we stand together, we can build the society we want, but I do believe that it's possible. Thanks.
So next we're going to have Nora Loreto, the author of the book From Demonized to Organized, Building the New Union Movement. Again, there are copies of the book available for sale at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives room at the back. And Nora's told me that she's here all night, so if you want an autograph from her, you're more than welcome to grab one there too.
Or you can put me up too, that'd be good too.
There you go.
I'm going to now read Nick Stark's speech. Wow, thank you so much for coming out tonight, and I thank you so much for the invitation. Like I feel great, actually. This makes me feel really great. You all should read books to feel great, because all of the work you do by yourself and crying into your computer and smashing your head against the keyboard, it becomes worth it when you see everyone in a room in a beautiful coffee shop like this. I have an enormously difficult task because I spoke to a good chunk of this crowd already today, and I can't give the same speech or the same jokes. So bear with me. Partly that means that I have to actually kind of burn through my thesis so that I don't bore half of the room, but also interest the other half of the room, and then I'm going to talk about something a bit different. And I also have to say, it is so cool to be here not pregnant, because I did most of the book tour while I was pregnant, and I am so drunk right now that that's awesome. Oh god, I hope my kids are okay. Where to start? I think it's so brilliant that Charlie started by talking about neoliberalism and also providing a definition for neoliberalism, because unless you're a pointy-headed academic at York University in Toronto, it's not necessarily a term you're throwing around all the time, right? But I think that neoliberalism is at the core of what we're facing. And part of what I try to do in the book is frame a discussion around neoliberalism to try and identify what it is that we're fighting against and what we're trying to build. Because I think that we have failed as a society, or as progressives, I think we've really failed at defining what the problems are. And because we haven't properly defined the problems, we are not employing the proper solutions, which has kind of put us into a bit of this, right? A whirlpool or a tailspin or something. And so when we're talking about neoliberalism, what is that? It's everything Charlie said. It was an excellent definition, but it actually has a more fundamental effect on how we see ourselves, and that effect has played out differently depending on what year you were born. And so I often talk to groups of people who are a lot older than the faces that I'm seeing here, and I often talk about, and then the folks who are perhaps a bit older, like, God bless you because you're still here and we love that. That was a joke. We do love you and we know you're still here, but you're an important part of the movement, critical even. But we have different experiences with neoliberalism, right? Depending on when you were born, you may remember a time where the welfare state, where social assistance, where helping each other out was like kind of what people did, right? It wasn't actually what people attacked. If you're my age or like really young, like Mr. Stark, you actually never knew a world like that. Ever. You never ever knew a world where it was normal to help people. And our humanity and our desire to help people and young people's desire to change the world and make it a better place, like Michael Jackson said, it's not gone anywhere, but we have no way to express it, we have no way to manifest it, and that has led to a real difficulty for young people to plug in. It has also meant that and a lot of times tried and tested or perhaps failed tactics of the labor movement are not attracting young people. And so when we hear young workers, it's always the labor movement tacked on and young workers. Just like the labor movement and racialized workers, or the labor movement and, disabled workers. It's always an add-on thing. We really haven't penetrated those locations that have blocked a lot of those of us who've tried to get involved. And so what's at play? Well, it's neoliberalism. It's the complete destruction of community that has made it so hard for us to find something to plug into. And all of you here tonight are part of a community. That's why you're here. And it is so much easier to do something when you're like, how the hell am I going to do this? And it's like, Solidarity Halifax. I'll get involved with them, right? The second that a community exists, you coalesce around it. Now, this is not inertia. Greed is not a natural element of humanity, right? There's a reason why Catholics are like, the 7 deadly sins, greed, right? It's because it's a sin. It's not normal, right? It's not goddamn normal for the Royal Bank to make money off me every time I take my money out of the bank. What the hell? That's my money! Right? Okay, it's the government of Quebec's money because I'm on social assistance because I just had kids. But, if I had a good union job, I'd actually have benefits, which I don't. So how did we get here? Well, it's actually a concentrated attack to make sure that we are so isolated from each other that me standing up here saying we should not be isolated from each other is a radical statement. Right? That is not right. When we are divided like this, we see attacks on young workers. We see two-tiered contracts. We see temporary foreign workers taking Canadian jobs, right? As if they're also not looking for work. We see that narrative be something we have to fight against. We see student debt be at its highest levels at all times. We see household debt being 168% of the average household income, right? As if that alone isn't sounding alarm bells, right? It isn't the Royal Bank of Canada's debt to the people for destroying Alberta through the tar sands. It is my home can't afford what we're trying to do and we're borrowing from the Royal Bank to exploit the tar sands and make money. It's a cycle. It's a dangerous cycle, and it's psychopathic, as the corporation, the movie The Corporation, very famously identified very simply. And so one of the most radical things we can do is actually organize, is to create and build community together, is to reach around the people who, sorry man, that we work with, that are in our communities to fight against that neoliberal current and build that community so that when a crisis affects one of us, it isn't a slogan that an injury to one is an injury to all. It's actually true. When my friends are injured, I am pissed and I'm going to do what it takes to help that person, right? These are not difficult concepts, and these are concepts that we on the left are saying all the time, but how do we put that into action? It's a very difficult question. And actually I'm going to explore solutions to that in the Q&A, because there's a whole other thing that I want to talk about before we get to that. So, through neoliberalism, we have been fundamentally, the foundations of our organizing and of our communities has been fundamentally damaged, right? It was a deliberate project of Margaret Thatcher, of Ronald Reagan, of Brian Mulroney, of Daryl Dexter, of people who say that they are helping the people in whatever way they think that they're helping the people, consistently helping their friends, the banks, corporations, and not helping the people. And this has seriously damaged our movements, and you all know this. The other side of this, though, is actually being accompanied by an incredible change to our civil liberties and an incredible change to what I would call, what many of you would probably call, the police state, right? When I was in grade 7, I grew up in Southern Ontario. When I was in grade 7, I was taught something that I think probably a lot of you in this room were probably taught too. What was the most egregious attack on civil liberties that had ever happened in Canada? Just yell it out. The War Measures Act. Everyone knows it was the War Measures Act, right? Where activists in Quebec were starting to really freak out politicians, and the response that politicians took was like, oh, they're freaking us out. Maybe we should call the army on them and arrest them all. Yeah, cool. And after that, we all learned that that was the most fundamental attack on our freedoms and our rights as citizens. And what was the result of that? Well, we got the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? This was never supposed to happen again. Right? Fast forward to 2010, and what happens? Come on.
GHG20.
The GHG20, right? And I know a lot of you are in the room. Wave if you were in the room. Yeah. No. Yeah, we were there together.
I was here.
Rebecca was there, here and there. Yeah, we were there. I was there. I got to meet the end of a baton from a cop. That piece of shit. He taught me to keep my distance from cops, though, so I didn't get arrested that weekend, because after I got smoked by a baton, I was not going near them. There were more than 1,000 people arrested that weekend, right? Arrested, rounded up, thrown into, not jail cells, holding pins that were created out of the Eastern Toronto film studios. Massive warehouses where they just threw people into caged fences, bathrooms were porta potties, people were there all weekend to figure it out. How many people in the end were found guilty? Even the people who were found guilty, we can really question whether or not they were guilty or whether or not they took the fall, right? So more than 1,000 people arrested there. Go to 2012, a whole new watermark emerges, the Quebec student strikes, right? The Quebec student strikes, inspiring, amazing, a lot of amazing work, a lot of amazing activists. What happens? 3,000 people, more than 3,000 people were arrested over the course of the Quebec student strikes. And they were arrested, ostensibly, for protesting, because protesting itself was made illegal, right? The Law 78. That law, and those protests toppled the government, right? Toppled the government of Jean Charest, which was amazing. The government of Pauline Marois took office in 2012 in fall, and the first thing that she did, one of the only promises she kept, was she got rid of Law 78. So now all of a sudden we were allowed to protest. We were allowed to gather in groups of 50 or more without telling the cops, yo, cops, guess what? 49 of my friends and I are gonna, party downtown and demand, justice. Like, how radical is that? A year later, celebrating the year anniversary for those protests, through various protests in the city of Montreal, we saw the first protest, 300 people arrested. Second protest, 400 people arrested. Earth Day, 300 people arrested. The actual numbers in my book, so it's a bit of a teaser, go buy my book. Or you can Google it. But people were being arrested for protesting, right? We have the right to protest. We have the right to protest stuff that is crazy. We have the right to protest stuff that is absolutely just. We have the right to protest whatever we want, right? It's called freedom of expression. And even if I personally would disagree with something that people protest, they have the right to protest. But in Quebec, we've lost that right, because municipal governments have taken the Law 78 and enacted them provincially or municipally, okay? And so on the books still today, it remains illegal under the Montreal Law P6 to protest in that way. But of course, we're not in Quebec, right? You're all like, heh, suckers, that's the one thing that we got on Quebec, right? Yeah, okay. Well, the federal government at the end of 2013 very quietly passed its own version of a law that was passed and tried out on protesters. And it was a law that banned wearing masks, okay? And so now, in Canada, you are not allowed to wear a mask at a demonstration that the cops deem illegal. Newsflash, cops can deem whatever the hell they want illegal, right? They can be like, whoa, this is a riot, it's illegal. And you're not allowed to wear a mask. Okay. You know, we can debate whether or not it's a cool tactic to wear a mask. Me, never wear a mask in public. Don't like masks. I think masks are freaky. In general, especially clown masks. But people want to wear that stuff. Okay, cool. Like, we can debate in our movements whether or not that's effective. But it's illegal in Canada to commit a crime wearing a disguise. It's even illegal to wear a disguise with the purpose of committing a crime. So why is it now all of a sudden illegal to wear a mask at a rally? Well, because they actually want to start making it normal that people protesting the streets, they're the crazy ones, you are the law-abiding ones, we are going to stop this before it gets real crazy, and you're just going to sit there and watch it and think it's cool, right? That law carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in jail. Okay? That's the same maximum sentence as second-degree murder. Okay? So they passed it very quietly, and I'm not even sure if you didn't know about it. That's cool. There's no test on how like progressive or wicked radical you are. Like, they passed that quietly, but that is an incredible. That sends an incredible chill on progressive movements. Where does that intersect with the labor movement? Well, it's very easy. Every single test that they enact on activists in Montreal is going to be employed against labor movements, against any union that wants to take radical action to protect their jobs, to protect the quality of their work environment. And it's not a hard stretch to think of that and what happened in Ontario under Bill 115, where with a stroke of a pen, every single elementary and secondary school teacher in Ontario lost the right to strike. Not even lost the right to strike, they lost the right to bargain. They had their contract imposed on them, okay? My first strike was 1997. My parents are high school teachers. We were on strike for 2 weeks. I was not a very political person. My parents, they were political, but they really didn't talk union politics with me at all. I couldn't tell you actually how they voted. I still can't tell you how my parents vote. That 2 weeks vacation in November of 1997, that changed us. That made me political, and that made my friends go, man, having a break in November is wicked, right? We need to remember that those are radicalizing moments, and those are the moments that that governments know create community. And there's a reason why those are being outlawed. There is a reason why when LRAD, those sound cannons are being purchased by Toronto police, why you folks need to be afraid. Right? But I don't mean afraid. I mean afraid and angry. And I want to circle back to my main thesis is when we build community, that's what's scaring the hell out of the Harper government and really all neoliberal governments within this country, regardless of their political stripe. When we start building community, it is the most radical thing that we can do. When people know that their neighbors have their back, they will stick their necks out for what's right and for what's just. And if you are in a unionized position with the privilege of not being fired, you have the responsibility to stick your neck out for your neighbors who are in precarious, who are in underemployed positions, or who are suffering or trying to get by day to day. And so I really encourage you, solidarity, community building, that's what's going to take down the Harper government. And my God, if they win in 2015, damn. But you know what? We can win in the streets. Thank you.
Can we get a round of applause for all three of our speakers? Thank you so much, Nick, Nora, and Charlie, for giving us a great introduction to this. I'm going to jump into a few of the questions that we've got prepared for some further discussion. But first, she's going to hate me for this, but I do want to thank the woman who has put all of the energy behind this event and making sure that it happened, Leslie Thompson from the Public Service Institute. I can't see see her face, so I'm sure she's playing. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. So, I'm going to jump into some fairly specific questions that I sent out to the panelists beforehand so that we could have a bit more of an in-depth discussion on a few key points. I've got 6 questions. I probably won't be going through all of them. It's 7:30 now, and we do need to actually be out of this room by 8:30. So I'm going to hopefully take about 30 minutes to go through some of these questions, and then we'll have about 20 minutes to 30 minutes to hear questions from the floor as well. There is still coffee and stuff back there. There are washrooms at the back. Do whatever you need to do. So the first question, I'm going to ask this to all 3 panelists. So the labor movement has reinvented itself many times in its history. For example, the change from craft unions and brotherhoods to industrial unions and social unions. And also things like the growth of the public sector unions, the inclusion of women in our movement. So what changes does the labor movement need to make to organize and engage young workers specifically?
Unions need to put more money behind external organizing just to get more young workers into the labor movement in the first place. I think the labor movement here needs to get better at working with social movements and create equity-seeking caucuses to work towards a more inclusive labor movement. There's no one easy solution. Young and older union activists need to look at the labor movement's flaws and come up with a proper strategy to address those flaws together.
Sweet. Okay. There are a lot of issues with the labor movement, honestly, and I'm sure for a lot of folks involved with the labor movement, I don't have to list them. You're actually quite aware of them. The difficulty is, the labor movement is premised on the idea that the expertise of any workplace exists with the workers. It's the workers that know the best, right? Same thing applies to the labor movement. It's the workers who know what's best in the labor movement, and I think that we need to start breaking down a lot of the silos that exist between leadership and people who are on the ground to really start to reinvigorate our movements. This afternoon I talked about how we need to even maybe reconceptualize the role of presidents. Like, why do we have a president? Who is the president? What is the role of the president? Should we start looking towards a structure where we actually have spokespeople? Because a lot of times it isn't a president we want. We don't want a leader. We want someone to express what the membership is saying. And the role of a spokesperson can be basically the same thing as a president, but there's a completely different space that surrounds that person. But more fundamentally than that, unions have to recognize that there is a generational crisis within their ranks. That there are different conversations happening and different experiences happening between young workers and older workers, and most of the time it's the older workers that dominate those leadership positions. And if we want to fundamentally include young people or any oppressed or marginalized community, there has to be a fundamental change in how we organize. Finally, I think unions do not bad at this, but we need to do more. We need to look at where the social movements are happening, and we need to support those in every way that we can. And for example, I think the most important social movement right now in Canada is Idle No More. I think that is the movement that needs to be unequivocally supported. Resources need to be given, activists need to be found and supported in any way possible. And I think the labor movement has to find those linkages, because the future of the labor movement relies on the existence of a country, right? The future of the labor movement relies on Canada existing, our land existing, our water existing, our air existing, right? This is a very fundamental thing. A lot of times labor activists think about, well, we need jobs and resource extraction gives us jobs, right? No, we need to be more clever than that. And it is the defenders of the land that are going to show us how to defend the land, and we need to be humble enough to take our leadership from the defenders of the land. So it's a tall order, because it really would be a radical change to the orientation of the labor movement, and you have to get the members on board. You have to get the dues-paying members on board to understand the interconnectedness of us all. But as young people, I think we're all aware, and a lot of not so young people, young at heart people, also know that the future of our movements requires the land. And if we don't address that, if we don't address climate change and climate chaos, well, we might as well just all sit in our basements and write emo songs. For example.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing tonight. So, I really do think... not really. So, I do think that the emphasis on communities of all kinds is very important, because that translates, you know, be it in labor, in the workplace, in terms of the environmental crisis and neighborhoods, building that kind of community it has a cross-movement kind of force. And I think a willingness, I obviously don't know a whole lot about the labor movement and its willingness to try new things, to adapt, to change. I have some idea, but I think that is necessary, and what Nora's saying about, for example, what happened in Quebec, and the kind of model they employ there. I mean, maybe that's not what works everywhere, but it's worth finding out, and, you know, we only learn by making mistakes. Oh God. So might as well try, I guess. That's my sense of how to evolve.
Thank you. So the labor movement in the last 20 years has fundamentally changed. It's not just changing, as some of our leaders say, it has fundamentally changed. Today in Canada, women are the majority in the labor movement. Historically, it was older, white, straight men from either coal mining, steel, auto manufacturing. That's no longer the base of the labor movement. Women make up over 50% in almost every one of the major unions in the country. And increasingly in larger urban centers like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, racialized workers now make up a majority of union members as well. But this is not necessarily reflected in the labor movement overall or in our leadership structures. So my question is that many young workers who get active in their union do come from equity-seeking groups, whether it's racialized workers, women, the queer community, disabled workers, First Nations, and others. What can the labor movement do to better support equity-seeking workers, specifically young workers?
Coincidentally, my union drive spearheads and myself fall into one of those categories. We're a part of the queer and trans equity-seeking group. Yeah, the labor movement needs to welcome us, get to know us, and help identify our allies.